a king who ruled for nearly half a century, watched his nation crumble into civil war, and made decisions that would forever change the course of European history. But did Italy actually win the war? And was this monarch secretly allied with Hitler? The answers will shock you. This is the story of how one small man made some of the biggest mistakes in modern history. Let's rewind to 1900 and meet the little king who tried to control a monster and ended up creating one. In the summer of 1900, Italy was in mourning. King Umberto I had been assassinated by an anarchist, and the throne passed to his son, a man few believed was ready to rule. His name was Victor Emmanuel III. Standing just 5 feet tall, he was shy, studious, and physically unassuming. In an era of towering monarchs and bombastic leaders, he was nicknamed the Little King, a title that would follow him for the rest of his life. Yet, for the first 2 decades of his reign, he was a surprising success. He oversaw a period of industrial growth and modernization. New factories churned out goods, cities expanded, and a fragile parliamentary democracy seemed to be taking root. He was seen as the perfect constitutional monarch, quiet, dutiful, and symbolic, a steady hand guiding the ship of state from a respectable distance. He rarely interfered in politics, preferring to spend his time on his world-renowned coin collection. He was the calm at the center of a rapidly changing nation. But beneath the calm, Italy was a volcano waiting to erupt. The First World War had shattered the country's optimism. Though Italy had fought on the winning side, it felt cheated out of the spoils of victory. The economy was in ruins, unemployment was rampant, and soldiers returned home not to parades but to poverty and chaos. The government was paralyzed, unable to stop the waves of strikes, factory occupations, and street brawls between communists and a new, radical political force. They wore black shirts, preached a doctrine of hyper-nationalism, and promised to restore order through violence. They were the fascists, and their leader was a former journalist with a magnetic personality and a lust for power, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini saw the chaos as his opportunity. In October 1922, he declared his intention to seize control. Thousands of his black shirt followers began to converge on the capital in what became known as the March on Rome. It was more of a political bluff than a military invasion. The Italian army was loyal to the king and far more powerful than Mussolini's disorganized militia. The prime minister begged Victor Emmanuel III to sign a decree declaring a state of emergency, which would have allowed the army to crush the fascists with ease. The generals were waiting for the order. The fate of the nation rested on the king's signature. But the king said no. Historians still debate his motives. Officially, he claimed he wanted to avoid a bloody civil war. But the truth was a cold, hard power calculation. He feared that the army might not be entirely loyal, that a civil war could cost him his throne. And perhaps he underestimated the man at his gates. He thought he could control Mussolini, use his popularity to stabilize the country, and then discard him when he was no longer needed. It was the single greatest miscalculation of his life. Instead of ordering the army to disperse the mob, he invited Mussolini to Rome and appointed him prime minister. That one signature turned a fragile democracy into the world's first fascist state. For the next 2 decades, Italy was ruled by an uneasy partnership between a king and a dictator. They were a study in contrasts. Mussolini was loud, arrogant, and theatrical, delivering speeches from balconies to adoring crowds. King Victor Emmanuel III remained quiet, withdrawn, and formal, a relic of an older world. In public, they maintained a facade of cooperation. Mussolini would bow to the king, and the king would approve Mussolini's laws. But behind closed doors, they loathed each other. The king saw Mussolini as a vulgar upstart, while Mussolini privately mocked the king's small stature and old-fashioned ways. Yet they depended on one another. The king provided Mussolini with the legitimacy he craved. Without the monarch's approval, the army and the old elites would never have accepted his rule. In return, Mussolini allowed the king to keep his crown, his palaces, and his titles. But it was a hollow crown. But soon, another dictator would enter the picture, one the king could neither tolerate nor ignore. In Germany, another charismatic nationalist was rising to power, closely modeling his movement on Italian fascism. His name was Adolf Hitler. Mussolini was flattered and intrigued by his German admirer, seeing him as a fellow revolutionary who could help him build a new Roman Empire. The King of Italy, however, was not impressed. When Victor Emmanuel III met Hitler for the first time during a state visit, the king was privately appalled. He found the German Führer to be crude, unstable, and utterly unpredictable. He saw in Hitler a dangerous fanaticism that went far beyond Mussolini's political opportunism. The king complained that being in a room with Hitler was physically unbearable. This personal disdain, however, never translated into political opposition. The alliance between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany was Mussolini's project, driven by a shared ideology and imperial ambition. The king, reduced to a ceremonial role, was nearly powerless to stop it. He signed the documents, attended the parades, and posed for photographs with a man he despised. The infamous Pact of Steel was signed in 1939, binding Italy to Germany in a military alliance. For King Victor Emmanuel III, this was not a partnership of shared values, but a political reality he had to accept. Mussolini admired Hitler. The king merely endured him. His silent complicity, born from years of political surrender, allowed Mussolini to chain Italy to the fate of Nazi Germany. The king's personal feelings didn't matter. His inaction did. In 1940, against his general's advice, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain, dragging an unprepared Italy into World War II. The result was disastrous. The army was poorly equipped, badly led, and lacked industrial strength. The invasion of Greece ended in stalemate. North Africa saw humiliating defeat, and an entire army perished at Stalingrad. The dream of a new Roman Empire was destroying Italy. Allied bombs rained on cities, food ran out, and soldiers wrote home about frostbite and despair. Once cheering Italians now cursed Mussolini, while King Victor Emmanuel III remained silent. By July 1943, after the Allied invasion of Sicily, the regime collapsed. On July 24th, the fascist Grand Council voted to strip Mussolini of power and restore authority to the king. The next day, Mussolini met Victor Emmanuel III, unaware of the trap. The king coldly told him the war was lost and that he was the most hated man in Italy. Mussolini was arrested as he left the villa. After 21 years, his rule ended, toppled not by revolution, but by the same quiet king who had empowered him. Yet the king's triumph was brief. He appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as prime minister, secretly negotiated with the Allies, and planned to switch sides. But when the armistice was announced on September 8, 1943, chaos erupted. The army received no orders, and Germany struck back immediately. Over 1 million Italian soldiers were captured, and the Germans occupied most of the country. They even rescued Mussolini and made him leader of a Nazi puppet state in the north. Italy split in two, Allied-controlled south and fascist north, torn by civil war. Instead of leading his people, Victor Emmanuel fled south, saving himself but losing his country and his people's respect. Did the King of Italy win the war? Technically, yes. Italy ended as a co-belligerent with the Allies, and Italian troops helped liberate their nation. But it was a hollow victory. The king lost all moral authority. Italians blamed him for fascism, defeat, and cowardice. In an attempt to save the monarchy, King Victor Emmanuel III gave up the throne to his son. But his son only reigned for 1 month before the Italian people voted 54-46 in favor of abolishing the monarchy and establishing an Italian republic. While the king survived the war, he lost his crown and died exiled in Egypt. The legacy of King Victor Emmanuel III remains deeply controversial. While many historians and commentators criticize him for his early complicity with Mussolini and the fascist regime, others argue that he was attempting to steer Italy through an incredibly difficult and volatile period. Some suggest that his cautious approach was intended to avoid plunging Italy into even greater chaos and to protect Italian lives from the devastating consequences of open confrontation with Hitler and Mussolini. In 1943, he made the bold move to dismiss Mussolini and eventually align Italy with the Allies, a decision that some regard as an act of courage in the face of overwhelming pressure. Public opinion about the king was deeply divided. reflected in the 1946 referendum to abolish the monarchy, which passed by a narrow margin of 54% to 46%. This razor-thin vote reveals that nearly half of Italians still supported him, underscoring the complexity of his role in Italian history and the nuanced debate about whether he was a cautious protector of his country or a flawed ruler who failed to fully stand up to fascism. Victor Emmanuel III remains a tragic and controversial figure. Was he weak or shrewd, a fearful man or a survivor? His reign shows that silence can be as dangerous as tyranny. Though he despised Hitler, his failure to stop Mussolini enabled the alliance that devastated Italy. In trying to control fascism, he unleashed it on his own country and the world.